quite exciting. Anyway, so I wanted to talk to you guys today about making auctions robust to aftermarkets. This is joint research with Moshe Babaioff, who's at Microsoft in Israel, Yingkai, who's currently at Kohl's, doing a postdoc at Kohl's, which is at Yale University. And this paper was done while he was an intern at Microsoft. We're currently, by the way, recruiting interns at Microsoft. So if you have any students that you think would enjoy doing an internship with us, please direct them to our website. You can find it by Googling economics and computation, Microsoft research. So this was an internship project with Yingkai. And then the other co-author is Brendan Lucier, who's my colleague here at Microsoft Research. Okay, so the motivation for this paper is to try and think about auction design in the broader economic context in which it exists. So traditionally, we've thought about auction design. What do we want to do in an auction? We'd like to allocate scarce resources to agents with private types. So the point of the auction is to elicit these types and understand what a good allocation might be. And there are many objectives, metrics by which you might measure the quality of the allocation. The one that I'll focus on in this talk is maximizing welfare. So we want to use an auction to choose an allocation that's going to maximize the value of that allocation to the agents in the equilibrium. And this is a well-studied problem. I'm sure you all know many solutions to this. For example, you could run a first price auction where you solicit the values from the agents and you allocate, say you're selling a single item, you allocate it to the agent with the highest value or the highest bid, and then charge them their bid. And the equilibrium of this first price auction, the Bayes-Nash equilibrium, will be efficient, so it's going to maximize welfare. You could also maybe run a second price auction where you solicit the bids and you allocate it to the highest bidder at the second highest price. Now, agents are going to bid truthfully, and there is an equilibrium in which agents bid truthfully. And so for that equilibrium, the welfare is again efficient or maximized. And here I would just want to point out, because it'll become important later, that this rationale for why second price auctions are efficient requires us to focus on equilibria in which agents don't overbid, because you can always have a really silly equilibrium in which the low value agent bids really, really high, and the agent with the highest value bids zero, because that's best response for him. But with no overbidding, second price auctions also maximize welfare. Okay, so if we know so much about maximizing welfare, then why am I still talking about it? And the reason is because when aftermarkets come into the picture, the welfare can drastically change of an auction. Right. And so the idea, what is an aftermarket? The idea is that agents can go into an auction and buy stuff, but then maybe they can decide to resell their winnings outside the auction, like after the auction concludes. So maybe I'm going to go to Christie's or Sotheby's and win a fabulous painting, and then I'm going to wait a few years, and then I'm going to resell it. And the fact that I can resell these my winnings in an auction is going to impact the welfare of the overall market. That is the market that consists of the auction together with this aftermarket. And so this kind of resale, of course, you might say, well, that can only help, right? Like I can't harm the allocation that the auction concluded with by doing resale, because in order to find someone to sell to, they have to have a higher value than the price I'm posting. So this intuitively should only improve efficiency. And in fact, it does improve efficiency, fixing the allocation that the auction computes. But the problem with this reasoning is that the very existence of this aftermarket can change the allocation that the auction computes. So the agents are going to, of course, anticipate that there's an aftermarket, and that's going to change their actions in the auction itself. It's going to change how they bid. Maybe they realize that they can engage in speculation and thereby have a chance of a really high payoff in the future by, grabbing some stuff in the auction, then reselling it later. And so the fact that these aftermarkets change the equilibrium can cause the welfare that the auction computes to be negatively impacted. So these sorts of distortions, and I'll show you some examples, can actually quite drastically harm the welfare guarantees of an auction that the auction would provide if it were run in isolation. And this is even accounting for the potential gains from the post-auction trade due to the aftermarket. This is, problematic if you're trying to design an auction that maximizes welfare. The design that you pick might not have any, of the properties that you expect if there's an aftermarket. And I think the thing I'd like to focus on in this talk is that the designer doesn't get to, the person that picks the auction format in a way that they're hoping maximizes revenue. This designer doesn't get to pick the format of the aftermarket, right? And so they can't design the aftermarket such that it works well in conjunction with the primary auction itself. And in fact, the designer might not even know that the aftermarket exists. And so what can we do to make this auction design robust to the potential existence of an aftermarket? And so this is the sort of general theoretical question that I'm interested in. And this question really grew, how robust are different auction formats to the distortion effects of aftermarkets. And so this question really grew out of a concern that we had in a kind of applied setting that we were working on here at Microsoft, and that is the climate economics, markets for carbon allowances in this particular case. So Microsoft, as you may know, has a goal to reduce emissions, become net zero by 2030. And the problem that Microsoft faces that they keep asking us about is there's just simply not enough, of an economy around carbon reduction technologies for Microsoft to achieve this goal. And so they need to work to create the market that doesn't exist yet. And so one of the I've been trying to think about many projects in this space. And one of the things that came out of this was thinking about how can we, there are some sort of ways that we could allocate the right to pollute, and there's many that are currently in use in practice. How do we know that these rights to pollute are being allocated to the companies whose pollution is the most efficient for society? And so these allocations are run currently through auctions. So an example of this that you can keep in your mind, we read up a lot on it, is the EU ETS, which sells carbon allowance licenses to companies. So the EU sets some goals for how much pollution they will permit. And then they sell these pollution permits or carbon allowance licenses to various firms in the European Union. And they'd like to do this in a way that, maximizes the value that these firms create from the pollution that they emit. And currently, the EU ETS uses a uniform price auction. We've studied various properties of this uniform price auction in isolation. And then we became interested in the fact that the EU ETS also has a well-acknowledged aftermarket, which I'll discuss in a moment. But before I get there, I just want to mention that this uniform price auction was chosen by the EU ETS to achieve several objectives. There's obviously the efficiency concern that I mentioned earlier, but you can read in the copious amount of documentation from the EU about this auction format, that they wanted to use uniform price auctions because they ensure transparency. They think of the uniform price auctions as allowing some kind of equitable access to various firms, both in terms of the information that is available about the market and in terms of the procedure of entering these auctions. And they also like uniform price auctions because it helps guarantee that participants do not undermine the operation of the auctions. So these are all kinds of rationales that we pulled out of documents that were published by the EU. And there's, it's not mathematical, so it's up to some interpretation about what all of these things mean. But I think it's important as we go through the solutions that I'll propose to keep this in the back of your mind, because you can't just come with some arbitrary implementation, and this is something that's really been drilled into me at Microsoft. You can't just come to an existing practice where there's some market in place and some, politicians and policies around that market and just propose a totally different implementation and expect it to be adopted, even if you can prove it's better. There's all of these kind of soft objectives that the market design needs to accommodate. Okay, so this is what the EU ETS is currently doing. And there's also, as I mentioned, in the EU, aftermarkets for these carbon licenses. So there's a website where you can go and trade in a sort of bid and ask kind of format the licenses that you've bought in the auctions that are run by the EU ETS. And there's a lot of data on these auctions, and you can go see how the prices change over time. These auctions, these aftermarkets are actually condoned and encouraged by the EU. There's many advantages of these aftermarkets. They provide access to smaller firms that maybe don't want to participate in the primary auction. So this idea of this equitable access is reinforced by the existence of the aftermarket. It also allows financial firms to sort of buy up, because these licenses are sold monthly over the course of the year, and then you have to present your license at the end of the year to cover the pollution that you created. So there's a lot of uncertainty for firms about how many licenses they need. And so you see in these auctions, these primary auctions, a lot of kind of financial firms that are buying up licenses and then reselling them, providing some sort of insurance to other firms that have unknown demand. So, these are good things about the aftermarkets, but of course, these aftermarkets open the door for speculation. And we read a paper by a European think tank, which noted that regulators are currently ill-equipped to appraise the beneficial and detrimental facets of speculation. This is talking about these specific EU ETS carbon auctions, and proper warning systems are wanting. And so, the results I'll present to you, I'm presenting them with an eye towards addressing this concern by providing auction formats that simply guarantee they won't suffer by potential speculators. So what are the results I'll tell you about today? I'm going to present first a negative result, which shows that the equilibrium welfare of a uniform price auction, such as the ones used by the EU ETS, can be arbitrarily worse than the optimal welfare. In fact, the welfare of this equilibrium that I'll show you is going to be a 1/log m factor worse than the optimal welfare, where m is the number of units for sale. And this, I'll show you how this works, but just intuitively, we already know in uniform price auctions that bidders can benefit through demand reduction. And so this equilibrium will have buyers strategically shading their bids or reducing their demand in order to get better prices for the units that they do win. And then there will be speculators that are going to place high bids. So the speculators have no value for the license themselves, but they'll be placing high bids in order to win licenses at a low price such that they can resell them. And so this kind of, and then the speculators are going to be reselling these licenses and have a monopoly power or, market power, and hence there will be a distortion because they're trying to get revenue instead of optimize welfare. And so, this is a negative result, and what can we do about it? And then, so I'll tell you several positive results. I'll show you that we can guarantee that this loss is at most a constant factor for very weak conditions on the aftermarket, and very weak conditions, in fact, even on the information structure of what types of information are leaked between the primary market and the aftermarket for certain auction formats. And so I'll show you that if the auction satisfies a condition called smoothness, which I'll introduce later, but an example of a smooth auction is a discriminatory auction, which is like, the multi-unit equivalent of a first price auction. So if the auctions are smooth, then we lose at most a constant factor. I'll also show you that if the auctions, the primary auction, the mechanism that the government runs is to simply post a price per unit and sell up to M units at that posted price, then so long as this price is appropriately tuned, satisfies in particular condition called balancedness, which I'll define later, then again, the loss due to of this combined market is at most a constant factor. And then finally, I'll criticize both of these discriminatory and posted price auctions from the perspective of the EU ETS and propose that for the EU ETS, what I would recommend if they want to guard against speculation is to introduce reserves into their existing uniform price auctions. I was told to stop periodically, so I guess now could be a good time for questions. This is kind of my motivation and the results I'll tell you, but if there are questions about the general setting, I'd be happy to take them now before I go into the details. Okay, so before I get into the details, I'll tell you a little bit about related work. There's, first of all, most relevant probably to, and in the minds of people in this crowd, is the work largely in the economics community of the equilibria of combined markets, that is, markets in which we have a primary market that's designed by a market designer and a secondary market that like an aftermarket that the designer doesn't have control over. And so there's been a lot of work looking into the characterization of the equilibria of these sorts of combined markets, looking at the implied inefficiency of these combined markets and also their revenue properties. So most relevant to this talk are the two papers of Hafalier and Krishna. The first paper in 2008 in AER, I believe, was looking at a very simple setting with a single unit for sale, a single item auction. And they wanted to understand the equilibria of this single item auction, and when there was the initial auction was either first price or second price, and then there was an aftermarket which simply had a posted take it or leave it offer by the winner of the first auction. Okay, and so what they showed in the 2008 paper is that this kind of the existence of this aftermarket can cause the revenue of the primary market to be higher in a first price auction than a second price auction. So it gives you a total revenue ranking. And then more related to what I want to talk about today is their follow-up paper in 2009, where they showed that the aftermarket in this, like for the first price auction, the existence of this aftermarket can cause an inefficiency. And they gave an example where they gave some conditions under which the market is still efficient, and then they gave an example where the market is inefficient. And I'd like to emphasize here that this paper, these two papers required a lot of assumptions about the form of the secondary market and the information structure of what happens between the primary and secondary market. And this is because in order to derive their results, they needed to characterize exactly the equilibria of the auction, of this game itself. And this kind of equilibrium characterization can be very challenging. In our paper, we're going to avoid the challenges of characterizing equilibria by simply bounding properties of the equilibria that are sufficient to conclude things about the efficiency. So we're going to be able to bound the efficiency of the equilibria without even understanding what the equilibrium is. So that's the most relevant related work. There's also been a lot of work in largely the CS literature on sequential auctions and on using these kinds of techniques that I'm referring to make conclusions about approximate efficiency of auction formats. And you can look into the paper for more details on that. So in the remainder of the talk, I'll first present to you the model, and then I'll describe the negative result that I've been referring to, that this aftermarket can really harm the equilibrium welfare compared to the auction in isolation. I'll then discuss 3 auction formats that are going to circumvent this negative result, and then I'll conclude. So my model is a very simple multi-unit allocation problem. There's going to be M units of a good that are for sale. These could be, for example, carbon licenses, and these units need to be sold to N buyers. Buyer I has some value for N quantity of units, some Xi number of units. I'll assume that these values are drawn independently across buyers from some potentially buyer-specific distribution, F. And we'll assume that these values have decreasing marginals. So the value for the 10th unit, the marginal value for the 10th unit is smaller than the marginal value for the 9th unit, and so on. And the welfare of allocation, then, the thing that I'm trying to optimize here is after the whole market has concluded, each firm is going to be holding some number of licenses, Xi, and what I'd like to do is maximize the sum of the values for these licenses. So the market, that's kind of like the allocation problem that the designer faces. And the market has 2 components. There's going to be a primary auction that the designer can choose the format of, and this auction will determine an initial allocation. And then there's going to be an aftermarket, and this aftermarket will need, I'll only ask, I want to leave, the format of the aftermarket very vague, because I assume that the designer doesn't have knowledge of it or control over it. I'll just ask that it satisfy 2 what I consider to be weak properties. The first is voluntary participation. So, after somebody participates in the primary auction, they're holding their initial allocation, they can choose to exit the market at that point and maintain the utility that they received in the primary auction. So there's some action that says, no, I don't want to participate in the aftermarket. And then I'll also ask for the aftermarket to have weak budget balance. That is, the aftermarket doesn't run a deficit. So trades can happen, and people can exchange payments, but there's no kind of insertion of money from an outside to facilitate this. And I didn't put it on this slide, but there's also some kind of, we formalize in the paper that there can be some information that's communicated after the auction and before the aftermarket, like maybe the bids could be published, for example, by the EU ETS, stuff like that. For the purposes of this talk, you can assume that after the agents know the priors, the Fs, and then after the auction, the allocation is publicly known and each agent knows their own payment. So these two market components suggest a game, a sequential game, in which each buyer first is going to choose bids to submit to the auction. And then the buyers are going to observe, as I said, the allocation and her own payment in that auction. And then in the next stage, the second stage, number 3 in this slide, each buyer will simultaneously choose an action in the aftermarket. And we would like to study the perfect Bayesian equilibria of this game. This is kind of the sense of the PBE is that, as you all know, there's going to be beliefs. And so each buyer has a belief, each participant in the market has a belief, which is part of the PBE if it's the posterior update, assuming the bidding strategies. There's also then the sort of subgame perfection requirement that the actions in the aftermarket must be such that they maximize the expected utility given the beliefs. And then the actions or rather bids in the primary market in the auction itself must maximize the expected utility given the actions in the aftermarket. Okay, so this is your standard solution concept for sequential games. And so I'll prove positive results about, I'll show you a negative result in which the PBE has poor welfare, and I'll show you positive results in which any PBE of this combined market game is guaranteed, so long as the auction has a particular format, is guaranteed to have high welfare. And just a comment, our positive results, in fact, hold for a weaker solution concept, namely B and E. And also our negative result holds for a stronger solution concept, sequential equilibria. But you can just keep in mind what's probably most natural for you, which is that we're studying the equilibria of the PBE of this combined market. Are there questions about this setup? Okay, the auction formats that I'll consider, I have M units for sale, and bidders, as I said, have decreasing marginal values for each unit. And so there's an example in this slide. We have bidder A who has value of 5 for the first unit, and it gets an additional 2 utils from the second unit and 0 from the third, and so on for B and C. And the 2 sort of most natural auctions are the uniform price auction and the discriminatory auction. In both of these auctions, the highest M bids, marginal bids win. So that would be like 5, 3, and 2 in this example on the slide. And in a discriminatory price auction, these bidders are going to pay their marginal bid for each unit. So bidder A would pay 7 and bidder B would pay 3. And we also think about uniform price auctions in which every unit that is won in the auction is equal to the same price. That's why it's called uniform price. This price could be in either the highest, anything between the lowest winning bid or the lowest winning bid and the highest losing bid. I'll assume that the uniform price is chosen to be the highest losing bid. So in this example, that price would be 1. We also will be considering posted prices. So in a posted pricing, the seller is going to pick some price P, which can be chosen as a function of the priors. And then bidders will approach sequentially and buy a desired quantity so among the stuff that's left over at that price P. All right, so let me now show you the negative result, which is that uniform price auctions can have pretty poor welfare and equilibrium. And before I get there, I guess I should tell you why that might be surprising. First of all, uniform price auction is like, based with a single unit is like a second price auction, where we know that when run in isolation, they are efficient, assuming undominated strategies or no overbidding. And in fact, this efficiency holds approximately for multi-unit auctions as well. So there's a theorem from the computer science literature by De Keyser, Markakis, Scheifer, and Telelis, which proves that uniform price auctions guarantee at least a constant fraction of, I guess this fraction's inverted, sorry, of the optimal welfare in any Bayes-Nash equilibrium with undominated strategies. So, they don't necessarily have to be efficient, and this is because people might want to engage in demand reduction, but they're guaranteed to be approximately efficient when there's no aftermarkets. And what I'll show you now is that when there are aftermarkets, even efficient auctions or approximately efficient auctions, like the uniform price one, can suffer unbounded loss. So to see that, let's consider the following example. I have three bidders. Bidder A has and B, they're both kind of like the actual firms in this economy, the ones that need to buy carbon licenses to cover their pollution. And bidder C, you can think of as the speculator. So bidders A and B both have a value of 2 for the first unit. And then bidder A is going to have some value, which is uniform 1 to 1.5 for the second unit and 0 for the third. So that's, bidder A wants 2 units and their value for the second one is random. Bidder B, on the other hand, is going to have a value of 2 for the first unit and then a value of ZB for any additional unit, some constant value ZB for any additional unit. And this ZB is going to be drawn uniformly from a distribution which has 2 components. There's sort of the probability of it being a low value is the first line here, and the probability for it being a value between 1 and 1 plus 2 over m, which is the maximum value of this buyer for additional units, being the second line here. So you can think of this as bidder B is going to be a low type, that is her value for additional units will be less than 1, and there's a distribution for these low types, or bidder B will be a high type, in which case her value for additional units is between 1 and 1 plus 1 over 2m, in which case the distribution for that will be the second, controlled by the second part of the CDF here. And so this is, feels like a kind of funny concocted example. It's chosen to have a particular property, which is that the expected value to bidder B of each unit after the first, we can calculate that. That's at least the expected value that she gets, that the low types would get. And so we can integrate the first part of this CDF and see that the expected value is going to be something like log m over m. So this is vanishing, of course, but positive. And so this is going to be the primary contribution to the welfare. But the revenue of this distribution, if you were facing a buyer whose value for units was ZB, what would you want to do to maximize your revenue? you would want to post a price of 1, because then you're going to sell to all the high types, and the high types exist. And I mean, you can calculate that this is the best choice of price, but or you could just trust me. So by posting a price of 1, the buyer is a high type with probability 1 over 2m, and if they're a high type, they're definitely going to buy, and so you get a revenue of 1 over 2m by posting a price per unit price of 1. And so these kind of high types are the ones that are contributing to wealth, to revenue. And so now you can kind of see where this is going. The equilibrium that I am going to propose, which has poor welfare properties, is that bidders A and B are going to, buy their first units. They're bidding 2 for their first unit and 0 for all the remaining units. And then bidder C is going to just snatch up all the remaining units by bidding 1 for them and 0 for the remaining for the rest. And so what's going to happen in this, like with these bids in the primary auction, is that the price is 0, right? Because there's exactly M units that have a positive bid. And that this is why bidders A and B don't want to increase their bids for units beyond the first, because then they would be suffering by paying a higher price for that 1 unit that they're actually buying in the primary market. And bidder C is buying all the remaining units, and so the allocation is 1 unit to A, 1 unit to B, and M minus 2 units to C. And now in the aftermarket, what's going to happen is that bidder C is going to set a posted price of 1. And so bidder A will buy for sure that unit at that posted price. And this is why bidder C finds it strictly beneficial to do this. And then bidder B will buy the remaining units if she's a high type. And so bidder C benefits from this sort of speculation. And so, there's a formal proof in the paper that this is a PBE, the strategies I suggest on this slide. But you can kind of see why this is bidder C is like the thing that's going wrong here is that bidder C is encouraged to buy specifically that unit that bidder A would like to has a value of at least 1 for. And because when she buys that large amount of units, then she can guarantee herself some positive payment in the second, in fact, large payment in the aftermarket. And so this kind of introduces, I like to think about this as it kind of, even though bidders have decreasing marginal values for units, the very existence of the aftermarket is essentially introducing some sort of complementarity into bidder C's effective value for the units that she's buying. Okay, so this is the PBE, and you can calculate the efficiency of this equilibrium that I've defined. The expected welfare, well, let's see, the bidder A is getting 2 units in this equilibrium, so she's contributing 3.5 to the expected welfare. Bidder B is getting 1 unit for sure, which she values at 2. And then with probability 1 over 2m, she's a high type, in which case she buys the remaining m minus 3 units from bidder C. And her value for these is at most 1 plus 1 over 2m. And so this in total gives a bound on the welfare of this PBE of 6, which is a constant. On the other hand, the optimal welfare, we can even just look at the welfare gained by allocating all units to the high type, the low type of bidder B, and that gives us a log m. So bidder B doesn't, the low types of bidder B don't have very much value for any given unit, but because there's so many of them, her value for all of them together could be like log m. And so what you see here is that the optimal welfare could be a log M factor higher than the welfare of the PBE of this uniform price auction. Okay, so that's problematic from the perspective of a designer that thought this uniform price auction, due to that results I cited from computer science, is going to have an approximately efficient equilibrium. So what can we do about this? Are there techniques that we can introduce that will guarantee that no matter what the aftermarket looks like, the outcome of the auction is approximately efficient? So I can pause here if there are questions about the negative result.
So Nicole?
Yeah.
In that example, you mentioned the log M basically decay. Do you know that that's sort of roughly the worst rate that you can get welfare to decay with M?
Yeah, good. So this is the worst case example that we have in this, this is in fact a sequential equilibrium. So it's a very strong solution concept. Each player is playing an undominated strategy. And so this is the best example we have for that PVE. But maybe there could be a worse example. Another thing is you could poke many holes in this example. One might be that it feels ridiculous to have, basically you could say, isn't it just the monopoly power of bidder C that's driving it? What if there's one buyer that's buying everything in the auction, surely the auction designer would figure it out and maybe try to regulate that away, right? And so we have in the appendix an example where there's no bidder after the primary auction, no bidder has more than a constant fraction of units. Yeah, there's other sorts of ways that we can talk about the robustness of this example. Another thing you could ask is this actually a problem in the EU ETS, if that's your motivation? And so we've tried to look into the data a bit to see if we could document inefficiencies arising from speculation. This is a really hard exercise, and thus far what we've been able to do is to document that there are bidders that have a high Herfindahl index, which is some measure of the market power of each bidder. So there are bidders that after the primary auction have some large market power, and there's a constant number of them. But other than that, we haven't been able to really see evidence of this issue.
Thank you. And then just clarifying, so when you have this negative result, basically the result is there exists a structure for the aftermarket such that the equilibrium is bad.
Yes, exactly.
Not there could be other structures for the aftermarket where no such thing occurs.
For example, if the aftermarket has no disallows trade, yeah.
Exactly. So then, yeah. But then the positive results are the ones for which the weak conditions you stated earlier.
Yes. Yeah.
Will be relevant.
Exactly. Yeah. Cool. So let me tell you about the positive results. First positive result is going to leverage this concept of smoothness, which was defined for games in a paper of Tim Rofgarden and for auctions in a paper of Serganis and Tardosh. And so I'm not going to have time to tell you exactly what smoothness is, but I'm going to try and give you some intuition, which is that a mechanism is considered smooth if there's this is the smoothness, the famous smoothness inequality is what's written in red in my slide. And basically it says that for any kind of value profile, each agent is going to be able to have a deviation, and they can grab some utility from this deviation potentially. And the idea is that the sum of these deviations together with the revenue of the auction itself, which you can think of as sort of the utility of the auctioneer, is large enough to cover the optimal welfare up to some approximation factors, lambda and mu. So I think all of us in computer science struggle a lot to give a very precise kind of economic intuition for what this inequality means. This is kind of the best I have, but really the point I want to make is that this is a super useful thing to leverage when you analyze auctions, because you don't need to understand the equilibrium. You just need to design these deviations and show that they satisfy this inequality. And if you can do that, if you can find these deviations and show that they satisfy this inequality, then the main proposition in this literature is that the optimal expected welfare is, or that the welfare of any equilibrium is close to the optimal expected welfare. So what we're able to show in this paper is that this kind of smoothness argument extends to markets in which there's an auction followed by an aftermarket, so long as that aftermarket satisfies these very weak conditions I mentioned up front of voluntary participation and weak budget bounds. And the idea is that we can use the deviations that are guaranteed by the smoothness of the primary auction to design deviations that show that the combined market satisfy the inequality I presented on the last slide. In the interest of time, I'll skip that proof, but what I like about this, what I want you to take away from this is that you're able to show this kind of welfare guarantee without even characterizing the equilibrium itself. You just have to find these deviations, and the deviations are supernatural. It's like using the fact that I can just decide not to participate to add that to my deviation from the smooth auction. Okay, so we know that if an auction is smooth, then even when it's followed by an aftermarket, its welfare guarantees will persist. And there's many smooth auctions. One example here would be discriminatory price auctions that I mentioned up front. And so you could say, well, the EU ETS could just run discriminatory price auctions, and they'll guarantee high welfare, even if there's unknown aftermarkets where people trade stuff and there's no guarantees on what that aftermarket looks like. So that's cool, but I would argue that, and there's nice things about discriminatory price auctions, especially from a theoretical perspective. The auction format is detail-free, so I didn't need to know anything about the priors to decide the format of the auction. I was just using that in the analysis. But these optimal bidding in this kind of discriminatory price auction can be quite complex, as noted by the fact that I didn't even try to analyze it, right? And so you could question if this would be very satisfactory to the EU ETS, where they cared about like equitable information access or transparency or the ease of playing the mechanism. And so for those reasons, we'd like to propose alternatives to smooth auctions, which include posted prices and reserves. So I'll talk first about posted prices. In a posted price mechanism, the auctioneer is going to fix some single price P, which is the price that she charges per unit. And then buyers arrive in some arbitrary order and can just snatch up units when they're still available at price P per unit. And so this is, some mechanism, and we want to understand what the welfare of this mechanism looks like. And so without an aftermarket, this is basically the famous profit inequality problem. So you have, let's say that there's just a single unit for sale. Everybody has some value for this single unit, and these values are drawn from some distribution. Each buyer has a distribution F sub I for their value for this single unit. The profit inequality problem says that if you set a price that's equal to the median of the distribution of the max values, then this is going to guarantee half the expected optimal welfare. This is a famous result of Samuel Kahn from the 80s, maybe. And so, indeed, you can get good welfare properties with a posted price mechanism. But with the aftermarket, we show in the paper that these kinds of median prices can have bad welfare properties because a low value buyer might want to purchase with an intent to resell, and then the monopolist distortions would cause a significant welfare loss in the aftermarket. So we have to be careful if we're going to run posted prices about the prices we set, and we have to be even more careful than we would if there were no aftermarkets. And the property that we end up needing for prices to perform well is something called balancedness. So prices are balanced if they're high enough that the prices paid kind of cover the loss in optimal welfare due to the allocation. And they have to be low enough such that these prices remain feasible even after these units are removed. Okay, so I don't have time to get into the details of balanced prices, but basically there's some properties need to hold, and the prices are somewhat delicate, but they just need to be set well. And if they're set well, then posting these prices is going to give you a welfare guarantee. Again, this is without aftermarkets. So we saw before that a price equal to the median of the distribution over max values guarantees half the optimal welfare. This was the Samuel Kahn result. There's another famous result that was derived in the computer science community by an undergraduate that didn't understand the proof in class. And this is Matt Weinberg, who's now a professor at Princeton, and he restated the proof differently and ended up with a new proof of how to sell a single unit and guarantee welfare. And his proof was to use a price equal to half the expected max value instead of the median. And the nice thing about this alternative is that these prices are balanced. And what we're able to show is that if you use balanced prices, then the welfare guarantees again persist in equilibrium. So the price that you end up needing to set to have a balanced price in the multi-unit auction setting is going to be equal to the 1/2m, where m again is the number of units of the optimal welfare, the expected optimal welfare. So by setting such prices, you're going to prevent the speculation. And you can see that in this example, because recall that the optimal welfare was something like log m. And if we set a posted price, which we've proved in the paper is balanced, of something like the 1/2m times the expected welfare, then you're going to cause bidder C to be discouraged from buying up those extra units and leveraging them with monopoly power in the secondary market, because they're just too expensive. And yet at the same time, they're cheap enough that bidder B will want to buy them. And so you can kind of see how these posted prices that were appropriately chosen resolve the issue that we found in the example in the introduction. So this suggests a posted price mechanism in which we post a price that's somehow well-tuned, and this requires the auctioneer or the designer to know the sort of expected optimal welfare in the market. And this is a nice mechanism because it has very low strategic complexity for buyers. They just know the price that's posted. But of course, it lacks price discovery. It requires the auctioneer to know this expected optimal. And I think more importantly, it's a large change compared to the existing implementation in the EU ETS. And in order to get that get some change through in a practical setting, you need to make small deltas from the existing implementations. And so that leads me to my final result, which I'll end with, which is that we can use these balanced prices in the context of a uniform price auction by introducing reserves. And so in a uniform price auction with reserves, the seller is going to have a per unit price P. The bidders declare their marginal values as before, and the highest M bids win. But now the bidders pay a per unit price that's equal to the max of the reserve and the highest losing bid. And what we show in the paper is that if you use these balanced prices from the posted pricing mechanisms as your reserve, then again, the expected welfare is at least half the expected optimal welfare in any Bayes-Nash equilibrium of the combined market. And I think that this is a nice kind of suggestion for the EU ETS. They currently don't use reserves, but introducing reserves that are somehow tuned to this optimal welfare, it's a minor change from their existing implementation and therefore inherits all of the rationale that they gave for why they wanted uniform price auctions in the first place. And while it might be a large assumption to think that the EU ETS has a sense of the expected optimal welfare, we show that if there's some error, if they have an estimation of it and there's some error in the estimation, then there's a bounded welfare loss due to the error in the estimation. So in conclusion, I think these are the main points I want you to take away. First of all, we wanted to think about auctions in the presence of aftermarkets. And we anticipated that, we showed that the anticipation of an aftermarket can cause a shift in the auction equilibrium itself, which can cause a reduction in welfare relative to the equilibrium of the auction in isolation. We then wanted to resolve this by cleverly choosing auction formats. We found it difficult to select among auction formats because characterizing the equilibrium with aftermarkets is very complex, but we were able to nonetheless provide guarantees by, instead of characterizing the equilibrium, using computer science techniques of smoothness and balanced prices to just bound the equilibrium welfare without characterizing what the equilibrium looks like. And then we applied this to the EU ETS, where we show that if the EU ETS just adopts a reserve price, they can move from a scenario in which they could have unbounded welfare loss with their uniform price auctions to one in which the welfare loss is at most a constant. Thank you.